Miranda and Earl Wilson lived in the small town of Glenfield, Virginia. They had been married for over 20 years. Miranda worked as a sales manager at a large company, while Earl owned a small hardware store. Over the past few years, age had started to take its toll on their relationship. Earl had turned 60, and Miranda was 45. Their intimate life began to suffer, and Earl was plagued with guilt for not being able to fully satisfy his wife. Sometimes he resorted to using Viagra, but it didn't always solve the problem. For Miranda's 45th birthday, Earl decided to surprise her. He rented a seaside cottage in the small town of Kittycock, Maryland, and prepared an unusual gift. During the celebratory dinner, he suggested that Miranda spend the night with a young man. Earl wasn't thrilled about the idea, but he wanted to please his wife. Miranda was embarrassed and hesitant for a long time, but after a few glasses of wine and an open conversation with her husband, she agreed to try it. The seaside cottage was the perfect setting for a romantic getaway. The evening began peacefully, with Earl and Miranda dining on the terrace. As time went by, the tension in the air became increasingly palpable. Miranda felt uneasy, knowing what lay ahead. At 9 p.m., Earl announced that it was time. Miranda nervously nodded and went to the bedroom to prepare. She put on new lingerie that Earl had given her that day and applied light makeup. As she looked at her reflection in the mirror, she couldn't shake off the feeling of insecurity and inner anxiety. Meanwhile, Earl paced nervously around the living room, checking his phone and mentally rehearsing his reaction to the forthcoming event. At 9:30, he heard a knock on the door. Earl opened it to reveal Ethan, a tall, muscular young man. Earl greeted him briefly and directed him to the bedroom door. Ethan entered the room, and Miranda offered a nervous smile. Noticing her unease, Ethan tried to calm her with gentle compliments. Meanwhile, Earl sat in the adjacent room, trying to keep himself composed. He listened to the sounds coming from the bedroom, imagining what was happening inside. Minutes passed, and the tension became unbearable. Earl felt his heart pounding and his mind racing with thoughts that he had made a mistake. It seemed that everything was going wrong. With each passing second, his anxiety grew, and finally, he couldn't take it any longer. Earl stood up, approached the bedroom door, and knocked. "Miranda, may I come in?" He managed to say, struggling with his words. From behind the door, Ethan's voice responded. "Earl, everything's fine. We're handling it. Please don't interfere." Those words set Earl off. He felt a surge of rage boiling inside him. Earl flung the door open and stormed into the room. "I said, don't interfere," Ethan repeated, rising from the bed and moving towards Earl. In that moment, Earl lost control. He grabbed the first object within reach, a heavy flower vase from the nightstand, and struck Ethan on the head with all his strength. The vase shattered, and Ethan collapsed on the floor, showing no signs of life. Miranda screamed in terror. She rushed to Ethan, trying to understand what had happened. Blood flowed from the wound on his head, and he remained motionless. Earl stood frozen, unable to believe what he had just done. They both knew there was no turning back. Their minds raced with thoughts of how to cover up the crime, and at some point, they realized they had no choice. Miranda and Earl set to work, unaware of the consequences that awaited them. Every action now could mean the difference between freedom and life imprisonment. First, they searched the cottage for suitable tools and materials to hide the body. Earl went to the garage, where he found an old saw, sturdy garbage bags, and rope. Meanwhile, Miranda cleaned up the broken vase and started scrubbing the blood from the carpet using soap and rags. They carefully moved Ethan's body to the bathroom. Earl felt his hands trembling as he began to saw the body into pieces. Miranda stood nearby, trying not to look at the gruesome task, but assisting her husband when necessary. Once the work was completed, They meticulously packed the body parts into garbage bags. Earl tied the bags with rope to make them easier to carry. Miranda, gasping from panic and stress, threw the clothing and all the rags used for cleaning the blood into one of the bags. Late at night, when everyone in the vicinity was asleep, Miranda and Earl quietly left the cottage, carrying the bags with them. They decided to drive to a wooded area located about 20 miles from the cottage. The forest was dense and infrequently visited, making it an ideal place to hide the body. The drive to the forest took about 30 minutes. Earl drove cautiously, trying not to exceed the speed limit or draw attention to themselves. They stopped the car by the roadside, took shovels that Earl had grabbed from the garage, and headed deeper into the forest with the heavy bags. Finding a suitable spot, they began to dig. After burying the body parts, they burned Ethan's clothing and rags in the fireplace, making sure no traces were left. Earl thoroughly cleaned the saw and other tools before putting them back in the garage. The next day, they left the cottage earlier than planned, telling the owners that urgent matters at the store required their immediate return. However, a week after their return, the police showed up at their door. Miranda was at work when Earl heard a knock. 2 detectives were standing on the doorstep. "Hello, Mr. Wilson. We're investigating the disappearance of Ethan Grayson. He was last seen taking a taxi to the seaside cottage you rented. We need to ask you a few questions," said one of the detectives, introducing himself as Detective Martin. Earl felt his heart start to race. He tried to stay calm and invited the detectives inside. "Of course, come in," he replied, pretending not to understand the gravity of the situation. Inside the house, the detectives asked a multitude of questions. How they had met Ethan, what he had been doing at the cottage, when he had left, and so on. Earl stuck to the prepared version of events. "I hired Ethan for a private dance for my wife's birthday. After the dance, he left. We don't know anything about what happened to him afterward." The detectives listened carefully, asking clarifying questions. They also took Miranda's contact information to question her later. Once the detectives left, Earl called his wife to inform her about the police visit. A month passed. The police investigation continued, but the Wilsons still hoped they might avoid exposure. Everything changed on a rainy day when news reports revealed that Ethan's remains had been found in a forest. The police immediately returned to the Wilsons. Earl and Miranda were once again called in for questioning, this time separately. The detectives decided to verify their statements and asked a multitude of questions about their route home, arrival times, and other details. It quickly became apparent that their answers did not match. "When did you get home?" Detective Martin asked Miranda. "We arrived around 6 in the evening." Miranda answered, trying to sound calm. "Your husband said you arrived around 8, the detective noted, looking intently at her. Miranda felt her heart start to race. She realized that their stories were beginning to diverge. Meanwhile, Earl was questioned about the same details. He too became tangled in his answers, and the detectives understood that they were hiding something. However, there was still no direct evidence against the Wilsons. The police decided to use a more cunning approach. The investigators decided to take a risky step and bluff. They knew that to close the case, they needed more than just the discrepancy between Miranda's and Earl's statements. When Miranda was called in for another interrogation, she was noticeably nervous. Detective Martin watched her closely. He approached Miranda with a stern expression, having carefully thought out every detail of his story. Martin started with neutral questions, revisiting the details they had already discussed, but then suddenly moved to the main point. He informed Miranda that Earl had already confessed and fully described what had happened. Miranda was stunned. She did not expect such a turn of events. The detective explained in detail that Earl had admitted to murdering Ethan and attempting to cover it up. He claimed that Earl had agreed to cooperate with the investigation in exchange for a reduced sentence. Miranda couldn't believe that Earl could betray her. But the detective's apparent confidence made her doubt her own thoughts. She recalled how they had carefully planned what to say to the police and how meticulously they had planned every detail. But now, all of it seemed pointless. Martin continued to press, asserting that Miranda needed to confess herself, or she would face life imprisonment. He spoke so convincingly that Miranda began to believe that her only chance was to tell the truth. Crushed by psychological pressure and the fear of the inevitable, Miranda broke down. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she eventually began to recount everything, from the night Ethan entered their home to how they had hidden his body in the forest. She described every detail, hoping that her confession would help mitigate her punishment. Meanwhile, Earl was in the adjacent room, unaware that their plan had just shattered into pieces. The trial of Miranda and Earl Wilson became the central event in Glenfield. The prosecutor began by outlining the charges. He described in detail how Miranda and Earl had planned and committed the murder of Ethan Grayson, and then attempted to cover up the crime. Photos from the crime scene were presented, as well as testimony from the detectives who conducted the investigation. The prosecutor emphasized the brutality of the crime and the cold-bloodedness with which the couple had tried to erase all traces of their actions. The defense attorney tried to challenge certain points, highlighting potential inaccuracies and attempting to mitigate the guilt of his clients. However, the evidence and confessions were sufficient to convince the jury. Earl, in a state of distress, recounted how he had intended to surprise his wife, but the situation spiraled out of control. He spoke of his guilt and regret. Miranda, with tears in her eyes, corroborated his account, adding that she had not wanted this to happen, but had acted under pressure from the circumstances. Earl was sentenced to 25 years in prison for premeditated murder and concealment of a body. Miranda received 15 years for being an accomplice and attempting to cover up the crime.